Okay, thank you. So thank you, Andreas. So I'm going to introduce Sandeep. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Sandeep Juneja. Sandeep is a professor at the School of Technology and Computer Science in Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai. And he got his PhD in 1993 from Stanford University. And he has held positions at a credit risk insurance company and then a consulting company before becoming a faculty member at IIT Delhi and then joining Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in 2002, if I'm right. Sandeep has a very wide range of scientific expertise in the very general field of applied probability, going from sequential learning, mathematical finance, Monte Carlo methods, and even game theory for the game theoretic analysis of cues. And more recently, the epidemiological modeling of COVID-19 spread analysis. So that's particularly the topic that is going to present. I've always been impressed by Sandeep's rigor and range of knowledge, and I came to know him thanks to his activity on relevant simulation and variance reduction technique, another topic on which he has been one of the most referenced persons. So Sandeep is going to present now his work on epidemiological modeling, and I'm pretty sure that it's a very hot topic and people will enjoy listening to him. So Sandeep, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Bruno, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Happy to be speaking on COVID. I presume everybody in the audience knows about COVID now. You heard about it somehow, right? That's maybe reasonable, and maybe also about the Delta variant. It's been in the news. Anyway, so this is an effort that, we got involved in March of 2020 when we saw COVID spreading to India. And we read, papers by Neil Ferguson in Cambridge, who was, showing off this huge number of fatalities that could potentially happen in UK and US, and that influenced the policy there. And he and his team were using Monte Carlo methods. So then, from that, we took off and created a Monte Carlo model for cities in India, primarily for India. So I'll talk about that. We were focusing primarily on Mumbai, and we've been in touch with the Mumbai government and the state of Maharashtra, where Mumbai is a city, on COVID. So I'll talk about those things. So I'll talk about some practical things that we did, but also there's an eminent and important need for theory. And we'll talk about how that comes in. So, I guess that fits in with this conference, that there's room to do very interesting and useful theory in this setting. So this is shift scale and restart smaller models to estimate larger ones. So we want to large models. Right now, our model takes 12, 13 hours per simulation run. So how do we get that done in an hour or maybe less than that? So agent-based simulators in epidemiology. My co-authors are Shubhadra Agarwal. She's a PhD student in TFR. And Daksh Mittal, who's been doing very impressive work with me. He's a research associate. All right, this is just a list of reports that we've come up with. Some of these are not really meant to be publications. We didn't spend that much of effort in refining them and sending them to a journal. But this was to inform the government and to inform the general public. So these are on the website. They're all available for you to see. I'll just give you a quick overview of as things stand in India. So last year we saw the first wave. I think the peak was around September. And, by around this time, people kind of thought by January, even early February, people thought that the worst was over for India. We were heavily infected already. And there was a lot of conjecture that maybe there's some kind of, inherent immunity that we have in South Asia and in India. So the disease was coming down. And then suddenly we got hit by Delta variant. Unimaginably, the numbers shot up. And then, you saw this huge rise, which was completely shocking at that time. It took us a while to get our bearing together and understand what's going on. But to give you a situation, in India, we have the second peak was in May 2021, 32 million reported cases already in a population of about 1.35 billion. And mind you, our estimation is that about 1 in 30 actual infection gets reported as a case. So actual number of infections are more of the order of over 900 million. So estimated, as per the latest Sero survey, more than 67% of population has been infected, and probably more than that because there's antibodies decay too. So we're not vaccinating people quite as much, but we have enough people infected, so there is enough protection in the air. So we hope. In Mumbai, Mumbai, you also saw some waves early on. The disease was actually much more so in Mumbai early on. And then the second wave first came to Maharashtra, where Mumbai is, and in Mumbai. So we saw this massive increase first in Mumbai, and then about a month later, it got down to other parts of India. It's more like people from Mumbai were traveling to other parts of India, and that's how we saw this massive second wave. So the peak here was in April, and about 750,000 people have been reported cases in a population of 13 million. And we estimate right now that more than 80% of Mumbai is already infected and has some kind of protection. Protection seems to be holding from infections. That's been good news. So in this talk, I'll talk about the simulation model that we had developed. We had tied up with our colleagues in ISC, in Institute of Science, and we'll have developed this agent-based simulation model. So I'll introduce that briefly. I'll presume everybody in this audience more or less understands how that simulation would run. So I won't spend too much time on this. I'll describe its successes and a failure. And the failure obviously was that nobody anticipated the Delta variant. So we made all kinds of predictions which kind of did not anticipate that. And to that extent, we were wrong. Then I'll talk about second wave. What does the simulation model tell us about the second wave? Post facto as well. What do we get from it? And then what can we say about the potential third wave? So these are applied things. There are lessons for simulation modelers in this. So I'll try to highlight those. But there were also kind of practical prescriptions we came out with. So I'll talk about that as well. But the key drawback in all of this is the enormous computation time that these models take. As I mentioned, 12 hours right now to run about 2 years of the city. So that's a massive amount of time. So how do we speed that up? So that requires developing deeper understanding of the underlying probabilistic structure of these simulation models, and hence of the disease progression itself, because these simulation models are far more detailed models of how disease is progressing, as opposed to these partial differential equation or ordinary differential equation based models, which are much more high level ones. So they miss out on the details. So in some sense, we are trying to capture reality much more. So what's the underlying probabilistic structure of the reality that is the underlying the disease spread? So initially, it's a branching process in the limit as population goes to infinity. In Mumbai, 13 million population, that's as close to infinity as you need to get. And then thereafter, there's a mean field behavior in the population. So once you exploit these facts, that initially you have a branching process, there's stochasticity, and very soon, stochasticity gives rise to a mean field deterministic behavior. With that, you get a great deal of insight into how the disease spreads and how the disease spreads in the simulation model. And we'll talk about how to exploit those things to come up with a faster model. So that's the aim of this talk. Please feel free to interject if you have any questions anytime in between. So we are going to simulate a 13 million city using a smaller 1 million city, and we can probably go down to 500,000 city as well. And we're going to use shift, scale, and restart features. And I introduce these to you. This is our way of using a smaller model to get precisely the same results that we would have gotten with the larger model. All right, so I'll just describe this agent-based simulation model. It allows for detailed modeling. As I mentioned, this work is by, it's carrying forward the work that's by Neil Ferguson and team in Cambridge. So we create a city, synthetic city, which has, population information matches the actual city. So 13 million people. We have the same number of households, more or less, same distribution of people in the households, same age group of people in the household. So using census data, all these are approximate, but ballpark, we're getting things right. Geographically, they're similarly distributed, and where they go to, people go to work, that's also more or less accurately done. We're not making precise predictions, so we allow room to make mistakes, and that allows us some approximations and all these things. But we need high performance computing nonetheless. Okay, this is just this is just to show you the map of Mumbai, the city. It's a city facing the Arabic Ocean, and this is where we are right now, right at this tip. So we see the sunset every evening. It's beautiful here. So if things ever improve, do come and visit Mumbai, and do come and visit TFR here. We are right on the ocean. And this is just to tell you that, age distribution, household distribution, so all that we have, we plug that in our model. This is important. This is telling you transition probabilities. If you're hospitalized and if you're between 40 to 49 years of age, there's a 6.3% chance that you'll become critical. If you're critical, there's half a chance that you won't survive. This goes back to data which was, by Verity and others, estimates of severity of COVID-19 disease. This was early last year. So this is based on China. Clinical data at that level of detail is not available in India right now, but ballpark, we do have numbers and we use them to adjust these numbers here. So that's how we've kind of gone about calibrating or setting parameters for our model. But our model is essentially going to be as follows. At every time period, we're going to look at each and every individual, right? Each individual is interacting. If the schools are open, then if the person goes to school, then there's interaction in school. So if there are people in the school who are infected, then this interaction will lead to infections coming from the school. In the communities, this means going to the malls, going to all kinds of shops, all kinds of social events. That's communities, workspaces, and of course, homes. And then there's also neighborhood cells. So I'll describe all these as I go along, but these are all the interaction spaces where people are going to meet, the susceptible and the infected, and the disease will transfer. So, and based on transmission rates, are infected, infect, and the uninfected. So that's the idea. All right. So let me just give you a big picture about the simulation dynamics. In this community, everybody kind of understands how the simulation model should look like. So initially, we'll create a synthetic city of about 13 million people. We'll seed it, and seeding is going to happen in mid-February 2020 with about 100 people somewhat randomly distributed who are infected, who are just exposed to a disease. They've taken a plane from somewhere outside, probably from Wuhan, and they've come to Mumbai and they're infected. And then, city is exactly as Mumbai is, more or less, in terms of distribution, distances traveled, so on and so forth. Trains are very important in Mumbai. 8 million people travel by train every day. So we need to capture that correctly. So we do that as well. Then at each step, each susceptible person's exposure rate is computed. So we go through each and every person who's in amongst 30 million people. And if they're susceptible, they've not been exposed, we find out the exposure rate. And the way we do that is we find the average amount of infection at home and multiply it by the home transmission rate, average infection at work multiplied by work transmission rate, community transmission rate, train transition rates, and also neighborhoods. I've not kept it here, but neighborhood cells was a new coding that we did, essentially because we said that every person has a close by neighborhood and all the contact tracing happens there. And when we contain people, so in Mumbai, containment was a big deal. Early on when the disease was spreading, when you see cases rise, hospitalization rise in a region, the municipal corporation would actually contain that region, draw a boundary around it, and basically not allow people to come outside or go inside that region. So these neighborhood cells that we talk about are, capture these kind of effects like containment. Plus, when you're doing contact tracing, essentially you're looking largely at workplaces, homes, and neighborhood, and all that is also captured. So then also this neighborhood becomes useful. All right. So like I said, so all of these basically, infected people seeing infection at home, work, neighborhood, community, and during travel, and whether they stay in high density area or not. So this was extremely important. Mumbai is an incredibly dense city, but even within Mumbai, half of the city or more than half the city lives in slums, which are far more dense. So how do you even begin to contain the disease there? So that's of course an issue. So we had to model those slums very differently separately from the rest of the city. And then restrictions were in place, could be local or at city level. So we need to model all the restrictions that government imposes, such as containment zones, such as lockdowns at local and global level. So once for each individual, we've gone through each individual, we find out now the average amount of infection present in each community, in each household, in each workplace. What's nice is that this is order n calculation. There were n people. we're not looking at pairwise interaction. So we find the average, at first go, we find the average amount of interaction, infection present at each and every one of these entities. It's an order n operation. And then we go through each and every susceptible person and flip a coin and decide whether the person gets infected or not. That's again an order n operation. So overall, the computation is order n, not order n squared. So that in that way, we get rid of the pairwise interaction, and that that helps us computationally quite a bit. For the exposed, the disease is, once you get exposed, so a coin is flipped, and if a susceptible person gets exposed, then they stochastically follow the disease progression chart. So I'll talk about that briefly. The time is then incremented and condition of the individual updated, and this continues till a large specified terminal time, such as 2 years nowadays. Okay, so disease progression, in case you've not seen it, this is again from the work that was done by the folks in, study was done in Wuhan last year. So exposed person is exposed for on an average 4.5 days. So this is for an earlier variant. This is probably, the numbers are very different for the Delta variant. And then they are pre-symptomatic for another half a day, but they're infectious at that time. Exposed person was not infectious, but now they're infectious. And then 40% of them, as per our calibration model, become symptomatic, and 60% actually become asymptomatic and recover. So they're not infectious anymore. Symptomatic, some fraction of them, age-dependent manner, get hospitalized. They stay in hospital for some time. And then again, in an age-dependent manner, they may become critical, some of them, and then some of them may not survive. So this is the disease progression. But the point is, once you are exposed, then this progression happens independent of everything else. You may infect others, but your own progression doesn't depend upon what happens to people around you. All right, so then there are basic interventions that we model. Let me just describe some very quickly. So lockdown, case isolation, home quarantine, schools closed, social distancing of the elderly. Nowadays, vaccinations are important, so we model those. We also model presence of variants and all that. We inject them in the system and see how they affect the infections, etc. So I'll talk about that briefly as we go on. And lockdown, what does that mean? So we'll have some proportion of population which is compliant, some proportion of population which is non-compliant. These are again set to early data. So earlier on, we found that maybe 60% compliance in non-slums, 40% in slums match the data well. So we went on with that early on, and then we changed it as per what we see in Google mobility data and other sources. But for compliant households, you could say that household rates are doubled. No workplace interactions except 25% leakage, because some essential services have to carry on. So some work has to go on. And community interaction reduced by 75%. And for non-compliant households, these numbers change. You can look at these numbers in the papers that I've shown to you, but you get the idea that we're trying to come up with a detailed model. And these numbers, we are just kind of, picking from thin air. I mean, they look reasonable. We calibrate broadly to the data, and then we don't worry about these numbers so much because we don't expect overall system to be so sensitive to these things. If you're matching early on well, we presume that whatever are the errors here, small errors, we can live with them. A lot of them are just canceling each other. And that, by and large, has been a fate that's kind of worked out for us. Okay, let me describe neighborhood cells and containment zones in some detail. So again, for each person, we are saying that there's a neighborhood cell around that person that the person lives in. It's about the same area as a 100 square meter circle. So 177 square meter squarish grid that we draw. So that's useful because we pick up people from the neighborhood for contact tracing. And when we do containment zones, something happened here. Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yep, no problem.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
Somehow my screen has gone blank. Okay, very good. Okay, and then for containers, for all of these things. And let me just say a few things here. So the way we modeled it was as follows: that suppose we see H number of hospitalizations in a region, in a neighborhood cell, and suppose we modeled that the containment effectiveness is 75%. Now, the way we implement it as follows, and suppose that this cell happens to have 3,000 neighbors in this cell. Then first hospitalization restricts movements by 25% for everybody in that cell, Because there's also a fear factor. A person is hospitalized, everybody knows, they become more careful. And then, of course, the government also starts to regulate movement. Second is another 50%, third is 75%, third onwards. Thereafter, we say that no further containment can happen. I mean, the reason I'm mentioning this detail is, first of all, it's kind of realistic. And secondly, as a function of amount of containment effort, the amount of restriction in movement is actually a concave function. So there's a non-linearity that comes in. So that's worth keeping in mind, that certain non-linearities are present in the system and they need to be modeled. All right, so let's carry on. So now I'll just show you very quickly some past projections for Mumbai. So this was our report in October 2020. Let me just explain this graph to you. So on the y-axis, we have fatalities. And these red bars that you're seeing, these are daily fatalities that actually happen in Mumbai as reported. Now, there's always excess deaths which are not reported. We believe that there was a lot of non-reporting which happened in April and May, because slums are very dense in Mumbai. The infection just went right through them and there were a lot of deaths. And, people are poor, their access to medical care is not so easy. So there was a lot of under-reporting of cases as well as deaths at that time. Nonetheless, we set our model to match this slope here. So this slope is basically when there's no intervention from the government at all. People are going about their business as there's no COVID, because the fatalities happen a month later. So this fatalities that we are seeing here, this is fatalities is what I'm talking about. We basically try to calibrate to the fatalities. So we match to this, and then we see the number, see how the trend is here, and we choose our compliance to match fatalities around here, including what we see from Google Mobility in terms of mobility of people. So that's how we set the numbers. In July, a sero survey was conducted in Mumbai. It was very interesting. It was the first time we found out that slums in Mumbai had about 56% people already infected, while non-slums had about 15% of people already infected. So just the discrepancy was quite interesting. It was, it kind of was unexpected worldwide. So we set our model to these broad numbers. And then, in August, there was a festival here, Ganpati festival. It's very popular in Mumbai, where people come out in large numbers and meet and celebrate. So there's a lot of intermingling that happens, primarily outdoors, but also indoors. So this is, one major super spreader event, and you can actually see that the spreader event has consequences. You do see fatalities rising because of that. But all this was very useful from modeling point of view. So then we knew how to model super spreader events. If there are holidays, if there's a lot of intermixing, we got an idea of how to model that. So with that, we came up with this projection of green line. If you open in November, city was wondering when to open. Then what will fatalities look like? If you open instead in January, what will the fatalities look like? So we came up with these projections. The details, again, are not so important. But this is the kind of projections we made at the end of October. And just to tell you how things turned out, so let's see. So this is how things turned out. The city actually opened on February 1st. February 1st was when all the local trains were open, workplaces became fully operational. And you can see that, this is the actual fatality that we are seeing here. And the data is not too far from what we had projected 3 months earlier. Our orange line, it's underestimating. But this underestimation is, understandable when you realize that we didn't anticipate that as cases come down, people's behavior changes. People become more lax, they go out more, they are much less careful. Once you account for that, these numbers are quite easy to explain. So, by this time, by January, February, we thought that, we had a pretty good simulation model. We are making very good predictions. Simulation is a great tool for these things. I was chatting with my advisor from past, Peter Glenn, as to how we should use Monte Carlo now to model climate change. Such a powerful tool, and it's pretty good. In any case, so that's, and our projection at that time was that if you open up on January 1st, if February 1st you just shift everything by 1 month, you see a small peak like this. So this is kind of what we had anticipated. But of course, all of us now know that when things opened up and people started intermingling more, what really was going on was that there was a Delta variant already present in the city and in the state. But because cases were coming down, movements were limited, it was not increasing fast at all. It was increasing by a very tiny amount. But once you give it a big impetus, once you allow people to intermingle a lot more, suddenly it shoots up. So we tried all kinds of, so this is where Monte Carlo became useful. So this graph is interesting in that manner. It explains the second wave for Mumbai. So this is exactly the fatalities that Mumbai saw. So very large numbers. What you also see is that it's quite small numbers right till here, and then there's a steep rise here, shockingly steep rise here. Completely unanticipated. Up till this time, we thought, okay, maybe it's just laxity of people. That's why we're seeing all of this. It's expected, all of this. But suddenly we were shocked by this. And then we asked ourselves how to explain these numbers. So we did extensive Monte Carlo. And again, the drawback of Monte Carlo was that it takes a long time right now. Each simulation at this time was taking 6-7 hours till this time of the year. So we tried all kinds of things. We varied reinfection numbers. We varied compliance, laxity, combination of that. What could explain all of this, all this steep rise all of a sudden in fatalities was that, if you have a tiny amount of variant present on February 1st, about 2.5%, best explain the data, which is about 2 to 2.5 times more infectious than the earlier variant. With that variant injected into our simulation model, we could exactly replicate this. This was interesting because, we said this at the end of April, that there exists a new variant which is 2 to 2.5 times more infectious than the existing earlier variant. And that seems to be ballpark correct for Delta variant. And we could draw this conclusion just by computationally trying to match the fatality data. So it's something interesting for Monte Carlo community that, computation does have a role to play in trying to understand how the disease is spreading, because it turned out to be reasonably accurate, as accurate as what we are getting from other sources. And then what we could say at that time, this was a report that we published in April, and some of the conclusions we announced earlier, we saw that, we had no idea at that time what the variant was, how infectious it was. So it was very difficult for us to predict peaks, etc. But our simulation model would tell us some things were invariant, that, the peak would actually occur in first week of May under a variety of different scenarios. Just the dynamics of disease is such. So there's a robustness to it, which a detailed simulation model can catch. And that the peak would come down by June 1st week. So these were announcements I remember making on Twitter end of March or mid-April or something, because we saw it in a variety of different scenarios. So these are by and large correct. So the point I'm making here is that some things we can still predict when we can't predict many things. So we couldn't predict how big the peak would be, but we could predict when it would be high and when it would come down. And by and large, those numbers kind of held on. So in that sense, Monte Carlo had a role to play. Let me talk a little bit about the third wave now. So how did we address this third wave issue? So because we are wiser now, we've realized that there's no, we don't really know how the world is going to evolve in the future anymore. This is no longer the naive world of November and December 2020. We are much, more kind of corrected people now. So we instead do scenario analysis. So we study peak fatalities under varying scenarios of reinfections. I'm only talking about fatalities here. Our simulation model allows us to study a variety of things, including infections, hospitalization, critical cases. But fatalities is the number that we trusted a lot more. So I'm just discussing that for now. And we study that under varying scenarios of reinfections, variants, and vaccine effectiveness. So we developed algorithms which roughly reflect all of these things in a reasonable manner in the simulation model. One can do these things. And then we said, peak deaths are a good measure of healthcare facilities needed. So we'll just predict peak deaths under a variety of these scenarios. And then timing of a new variant and when reinfections will happen are difficult to predict, the severity of reinfections. So we just assume a worst case of June 1st. This is all being done around June 1st, before June 1st. As per our model, on June 1st, around 20% of population of Mumbai was susceptible, 80% was already infected. And 10% of this had been vaccinated. A lot of vaccines were, 80% of vaccines were being given to people who were already infected. So not really having that much of a bang for the buck at that time. So what really was playing more of a role was that people were infected, already a large number. So if they have protection, then we are in reasonable shape. So this is just to give you an idea that this is the peak fatalities we saw last year, I guess it was June 2020, and then in this year, May, we saw somewhat smaller number of fatalities. And this is different scenarios, vaccine effectiveness of 30%, extensive vaccine coverage, vaccine effectiveness of 75%, extensive vaccine coverage, so on and so forth. And then we consider different scenarios like, okay, suppose I have reinfection of 0%. Let me just erase a few things here. Amongst all the population that's there, 5%, all the people that have already been infected, now let's say 5% are again amenable to reinfection as if they were never been infected, or 10% are amenable to infection as if they've never been infected, then what would happen? And then we said, okay, if you have a new variant which is further 50% more infectious, then what would happen? And if it's 50% more virulent, then what would happen? So these are all these kind of peaks. I don't want to go into the details. That's not the objective of this talk. But the big picture was that what one needs to worry about in a city which is already 80% infected is the chance of reinfection. If you have a variant, if people suddenly lose immunity because the antibodies have declined, or because there's a new variant which does not respect the protection they got from the previous infection or previous vaccinations, then we're in trouble. Otherwise, things don't look so bad. I think, and that's kind of where we are right now. So far, things don't look so bad for Mumbai, but Mumbai is just opened up, so we are going to keep our eyes open in the next few weeks. So next few weeks, if it's just opened up in a big way, if there's no new variant with dangerous characteristics, we expect to see mild increase in numbers. On the other hand, if there is, then we are back to seeing large peaks. But the point of this exercise was to tell the government that in reasonably pessimistic scenario, also your largest peaks will match the peaks that you saw in the second wave. So you don't need to prepare much more than that. So that's something to be kept in mind for the government. There should be panic, but in a controlled manner. But we have our eyes on the ground. All right, the key drawback of everything that we're doing is that computer time taken to run the city. So can a smaller city give us the correct answers? That's a key question that we ask. And the answer is yes, if each susceptible individual sees the same infection rate and it does not get too noisy. So, 1 million city vis-a-vis 13 million city, if each individual is seeing the similar environment, then you can, you have similar number of infections. You can simply scale up the numbers by a factor of 13 and you get the numbers for the larger city from the smaller city. And this we'll see when we can do that. Initially, it gets noisy, so initially you can't scale up. But initially, if I start a 1 million city with, say, 100 infections, or I start a 10 million city with 100 infections, presumably the size of the city doesn't matter so much. It's 100 independent branching processes which are evolving independent of each other. So in that case, the size doesn't matter. So you might as well have 100 people in a smaller city and see how they evolve, and you get a pretty good idea of how they would evolve in a bigger city. So that's the branching process, stochastic regime. And pretty soon you have enough infection so that although the starting point can be random, thereafter the behavior is more or less deterministic. So it's a mean field approximation that's playing a role. And in the mean field approximation, one can scale. So one can scale the numbers by a factor of 13 and get the answers for big city from the answers from the small city. So let me just give you some pictures here. So this is now, I'm doing no intervention scenario. So there's no intervention done to the city. Initial infections are 128 in a 12.8 million proper city for Mumbai. And I'm comparing that to initial infections of 10 in a 1 million city. So 1 million city is scaled down by 12.8 factors. So I have 10 times less infections to begin with. And I'm comparing the number of infections that I see in the two cities on a daily basis. So what you see is initially in both these cities, and I'm scaling the numbers, whatever I see in the smaller 1 million city, I multiply by a factor of 10. So you see similar numbers in the beginning, but then you actually see that the actual city has far larger peak than the smaller cities, which I've scaled up by a factor of 12.8. Smaller city has a lower peak. So what's going on here? Again, some kind of convexity is in play. In the smaller city, when I start with 10 people, there are many scenarios when the infection just dies down. And then the few scenarios where it goes up quite a bit. And if it goes up by quite a bit, by this time, there's so many people who are already infected that when they infect new people, they are, they're wasting, in fact, they're hitting the person who's already infected much more than their counterparts in the larger city. So hence they are successful from their point of view, infections are less, and that's why you see a smaller number here compared to here. All of this can be explained by analysis, but that's why you see that naive scaling will not work as you'd imagine. So naive scaling, of course, is a bad idea. So one has to be careful how to create a small city from a big city. Okay, now these are same pictures, but now I've started here, in this, I have 100 people in 1 million city, 100 people infected to begin with, and I have 1,280 people in a 12.8 million city. And then I see that the numbers are matching quite well in this picture. And here I made this matter even worse. I have now 1,000 people infected in 1 million city in February 2020, and I have 12,800 people infected in that 12.8 million city, and you see a perfect match. So that's good. That tells you that if you have enough infections in the system evolves more or less in a mean field deterministic manner, and you can simply just scale them by a factor to get numbers from a small city for the larger city. Now in this model, I've not modeled a neighborhood cell. So there are no neighborhood cells being modeled, because we were not doing that early on. But if we were to model neighborhood cells, so now this is, this is actually 3 pictures here. 12.8 million city, that's blue curve, which you can't see. 1 million city with a large neighborhood cell, and 1 million city with same neighborhood cell as the large city. So, neighborhood cell was for us a geographical region. So we said 100 square meter around a person is its neighborhood cell. So some infection happens because that person goes in the neighborhood quite a bit. So now with that, if I keep that size the same, then in the smaller city, I'll have smaller number of people in the neighborhood, and that will be, their infections will be more noisy, although I'm scaling things up, and that noise shows up here. The noise causes some kind of convexity, which leads to underestimation early on. So it's not quite matching, but what I can do is, in the smaller city, I can have a larger neighborhood. I increase the neighborhood size so that the neighborhood has the same people as I would have in the bigger city. And now each person, whether they're in the bigger city or in the smaller city, is seeing the same number of people in the neighborhood, and then I get a perfect match. So these two curves, blue and orange, are exactly matching. So when there are subtleties, one has to be careful when you construct a smaller model to match the larger model. You have to be careful about some of the nonlinearities. And in this case, by keeping the neighborhood cells of the same size, you are able to actually address that issue. Now things get a little bit more interesting when we also include containment. So remember, the point was, I am now living in a neighborhood, and suppose there are some hospitalizations in the neighborhood. In that case, there's a containment effort by the government. People are not allowed to move around inside or outside that region. That happened a great deal in Mumbai. So if I keep the cells the same in the small city and the large city, then in the small city, I had the same cell with less number of people. So then, containment will be actually, acting. Let me just see if I can get this right. It will be containing people less in the smaller city, the same region, and I'll actually see more infections. So this is, this curve that I have here is containment effort in the smaller city when the geographical size of the containment zone of neighborhood cell is unchanged. But when I change the neighborhood cell again, so that I have, I make it bigger so that the smaller city and the bigger city see same number of people in the neighborhood, then I get more or less perfect match. That's given right here. So because they're seeing exactly the same number of people, the effect is exactly similar. So even though there's a nonlinearity, which would have, if it was linear, then this would have averaged out. Because it's nonlinear, I'm seeing this peak. But because I've kept the cells exactly the same in the small city and the big city, the nonlinearity doesn't matter. The two systems still match, and I get a perfect match by scaling. So the bigger point is the nuances here, but one has to develop a smaller city in a nuanced model so that when you scale it, you exactly get the results for the large city. So that's a big message that I want to give here. Any questions so far? I've been talking for a long time.
Doesn't look like 15 minutes, Sandeep.
Okay, very good, very good. So this is another picture here, which is saying that if I start with the 100 million people, 100 people in a larger city of 12.8 million people, or 100 people in a 1 million city initially, both of them have identical number of infections right up to day 35. So this day 35 can also be estimated from data. It's a function of the growth rate of the underlying branching process. But the point is they're more or less identical, which is what I mentioned earlier. These are branching processes which are evolving independently. Okay, so now the general principles to keep in mind. Initially, there's stochasticity and the system behaves like a branching process. City size per se does not matter much. And once a deterministic phase is reached, once there's enough infection, if susceptible population at each interaction space faces the same amount of infection rate in a small city as it does in the large city, then the infection spread and other medical statistics are related to each other by a scaling factor. So then we can do scaling. So those are things we have to be careful about when we construct the small model. So now I'll introduce what we do, what I call shift, scale, and restart smaller models to estimate the larger ones. So this is an example of what happens. Again, this is a no intervention setting. So I start the small city with 100 people infection on February 2020. On day 35, in the 1 million model, I have 50,000 infection. I have 50,000 people who are infected. This, to me, suggests that in the 12.8 million city also, on day 35, I'll have 50,000 infection because they're similar. But then I find that on day 21.5 in 1 million city, I had 50,000 divided by 12.8 number of infection. So now on day 21.5, my smaller city is already in its mean field phase. It has enough number of infections already. So if I just observe what happens to it on day 25, 21.5, sorry, somewhere around here. And if I multiply this by a factor of 12.8, I'm exactly matching the big city, what it looks like on day 35. Day 35, I guess, is somewhere here. So what I'll do is I'll just look at this curve henceforth, and I'll paste this curve around here. Or I'll scale this curve and then I'll paste it around here. And that's exactly what I've done for you in these two curves, and you get a perfect match. So just by shifting from day 35 to day 21.5, so that the smaller city has the scaled number of infections as the larger city, and thereafter scaling the output, I get a perfect match. So this is a shifting and scale version. Now, what else can happen? Now, it could happen that in my model, on day 40, I had implemented home quarantine. So people, whoever were close to somebody who got infected, had to be home quarantined. So then again, on day 35, in my 1 million model, when I have 50,000 infection, I go back to day 21.5. Now that becomes, that's, I scale it by 12.8. So that becomes a representation for how the bigger model would look like when I scale it by 12.8 on day 35. So what I'll do is I'll restart my model, and 5 days after day 21.5, on day 26.5, I'll start home quarantine. So I'm restarting a smaller model, and at the right time, I deduce the home quarantine feature. So now again, I get a perfect match. This is two curves. One is a big city, one is a small city, and they're giving exactly the same numbers. So this is the feature of restart. And now I should mention in all of this, what I've also done is I've shrunk for the smaller city, I've made the neighborhood cells larger so that whether you have a small city or a large city, they have the same, each neighborhood cell has the same number of people. So same amount of infection behavior coming from the neighborhood cells. With all of that, I more or less get a perfect match. So this is for about a year, the two systems with all the realistic interventions. And I more or less get right numbers. And in our business, these kind of accuracies are nothing. We are supposed to get the broad trends right. Simulation models are not to give you exact numbers. They're just to get the broad trends right. And you're doing a pretty good job of that. Okay, so now let me just tell you the mathematics that goes behind this in the last 10 minutes. So supporting analysis in an asymptotic regime. So we'll embed the problem in an asymptotic regime. We'll examine a sequence of systems indexed by n, the number of people in the system. So home, school, and workplace structure is independent of n. So my N is increasing, 1 million is one candidate, 13 million is another candidate. But whether I have 1 million people or 13 million people, the size of home, the age distribution of people is independent of N. Similarly with workplaces, similarly actually with the neighborhood size as well. So neighborhood size will reduce with N, but the number of people in the neighborhood will remain the same. So the number of neighborhoods that I have are going to increase with N. So amount of neighborhoods, just like amount of homes and amount of workplaces, they are increasing with N. Their sizes are remaining the same. Communities, so people also meet in broader communities. Communities, I'm going to assume, then they also meet in large trains, for example, in Mumbai. I will assume that they remain the same. So the same, so their population increases with N. So communities are in size are remaining the same, but their populations are going to increase with M. And here we'll see that early on, a lot of people are independently kind of infecting people in their house or nearby, and they're engaging with a wider population through the community. And it's as if the community, because it has so many susceptible people, early on, the few infections don't really matter. They can be ignored. So that, that region can be identified, and then there's a phase change when actually this does matter. Okay. So I'll assume that there's a multi-type branching process. Let me just do a quick recap. So there are finite M particle type. Recall branching processes. You have a particle that this is Galton-Watson branching process. It has some children. Each child in turn, so per particle dies after some time. It has some children. Each child will have same number of children in probability distribution. Then it dies away. And if on an average children are more than one, then the population is going to increase on average. The multi-type is that the children can be of multiple type. They can be smiling, like in this picture, but they could also be not smiling. So, you can have multiple type of types. So M is a matrix where Mij denotes the expected number of type J offspring of single type I particle in one generation. So maximum Perron-Frobenius eigenvalue, so this M matrix here is going to be strictly, it's non-negative. So Perron-Frobenius theorem tells you that there exists a eigenvalue rho, and rho will have to be greater than 1 for the infection to grow, so that this M to the power N, when normalized by this Perron-Frobenius eigenvalue, it converges to this this product of this U is the right eigenvector and V is the left eigenvector function. So to the product of these. So this is just well-known stuff in multi-type branching process. Okay. With this, we get that vector Zn, which denotes the number of particles of each type at time n. So this is now the actual number of particles of each type. That when you scale down by rho to the power minus n, that's going to look like, again, this eigenfunction, left eigenfunction V, times a random variable V. So what that means is that all the different types of infected people that we have, they're all either going to become large together or going to remain small together, depending on the sample path. And that factor of largeness and smallness is governed by this random variable W. But the proportion of different types are stabilizing. So just to give you the big picture, the initial stage of simulation is a branching process. So population is divided in order 1 size groups. So I'll assume that population is divided in groups, and there are order n number of groups. So I have to divide population in groups just to make the mathematics simpler. Multi-type branching processes are easier to deal with than branching processes on general state space. So certain results which we want to prove are much harder to prove in that setting, in a general setting. So I'll assume there are just multi-type branching processes. Each group has individuals who interact with each other at home, schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, and within the group. Groups can be in various states, but it's the number of states that groups can be is finite. So that's going to be important. All possible group configurations denote the types. So all possible states that the groups can be in, it's finite. So that's a finite number of types that I have. Groups interact with the remaining population in communities and in public transport. So these different groups, they transfer infection to each other through communities. That's where they meet, or through public transport in case of Mumbai. And then we observe that till time 1 minus epsilon into log n divided by log rho. Rho is the growth parameter of the Perron-Frobenius eigenvalue. It is the Perron-Frobenius eigenvalue. It's greater than 1. N is the n number of people in the system. So till this much time, infected people essentially meet only susceptibles in communities. Because communities are so large that the infected people are tiny basically in that, and they can be ignored, and in public transport. So you can assume that the process is evolving as a branching process. The interactions are negligible till that time. So till that time, if you see the fraction of people who are of type I, that is actually converging to a constant. So this is what allows us, when I told you we do this shift and rescale and all of that, the underlying distributions are stabilizing. So you don't have to worry about the fact that the underlying distributions are different. So that's why I can stick one point and paste it at the other point. Because we have this limit theorem which tells us that they have the same distribution. This is all the time, essentially, all the way up to 1 minus epsilon into log n upon log rho. So Zn again denotes the number of particles of each type at time n. V is the left eigenfunction, and m is our matrix of children that you have, expected number of children you have in one time period. Okay, so after some time, infected group proportions are maintained. So the initial distribution of people in different states is stabilizing, and population is growing exponentially early on. All right, and then after about this much time, log epsilon n upon log rho, for some epsilon small enough and positive, one can show that the underlying distribution mu 0 n, the proportions as a function of n, it's stabilizing, it's converging to a constant. So there's a limiting distribution it's converging to. And thereafter, the whole process evolves, basically the evolution of the process. So this is the empirical distribution at time n minus 1. This is the empirical distribution at time n. That's basically following, the mean field behavior. Because the noise, the difference between this and the mean field limit is actually, it's a martingale, and that's going to 0. So that can be shown. So the mean field approximations become very, are basically explaining the behavior thereafter. So thereafter, the infection process has order n infections, and in combination with susceptible population, evolves very close to its mean field limit with random initial point. So the only randomness really that comes is from early on, from W, and that affects the starting point of this path that carries on thereafter. And the empirical distribution converges to a limiting process, mu t. Okay, so the empirical distribution converges to a limiting process, mu t. The number of infected at time t in system of size n is approximated by n times f of mu t. Mu t is the limiting distribution that the empirical distribution is converging to. F is some function which is capturing the number hospitalized or the number infected in any particular time period. So you just multiply that by n and you get the number. So what that means from simulation point of view is that if you want to find out what the system looks like of size n2, you simply use the empirical distribution at a smaller number n1, because this empirical distribution is more or less stabilized, which is what our data is telling us. So in our 1 million city, so we know in each type what fraction of people are infected or hospitalized or so on. So you compute those numbers, multiply it by n of 2, and that gives you a pretty good idea of what the system looks like for a larger city. So similarly, all the other medical statistics are approximated. So this is how the theory basically explains the experimental results that we saw. Okay, so there are other enhancements too, which are not so big a deal, but in the initial phase, we have stochasticity. So I just want to make 2 big points before I stop. One is that, once the process becomes deterministic, there's no room for variance reduction. You do variance reduction when there's variance. If there's no variance, there's no room for variance reduction. But there is variance early on. Early on, things are stochastic. And one place where you can reduce variance is once a person becomes infected, thereafter its behavior, its disease progression is independent of everybody else. And we know those conditional probabilities, etc. So instead of randomly flipping coins, you can just use those conditional probabilities, which we can numerically compute. And that helps you in model calibration and some amount of estimation early on. So that gives you a lot of variance reduction. So those are other enhancements that we do. Let me end with this. So in summary, I described the TFR simulation model. We discussed some of our projections in the past. We dug into probabilistic structures of the ABS models in an asymptotic regime. And we introduced shift, scale, and restart approach to use small models to estimate the large ones. So I think, it seems that, although Monte Carlo methods have been used by epidemiologists a lot, but our community has not kind of, approached these models with the view to speed up computation So hopefully, our research is in that direction, and hopefully there's a lot more of that to come from all of us. Thank you.